Long before the founding of the United States, millions of indigenous people were already living across the land. Most historians believe the first humans arrived from Asia during the last ice age, crossing a land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska. Over many generations, these early peoples spread throughout the continent, forming unique cultures that adapted to their environments. By the time Europeans first made contact, an estimated 5 to 10 million indigenous people lived in what is now the United States. They spoke over 2,000 distinct languages and belonged to hundreds of different nations and tribes. Many indigenous groups practice agriculture, cultivating crops such as maize, beans, and squash. These crops became dietary staples and allowed for stable, settled communities. Land was typically held communally rather than privately owned, and nature was viewed as sacred and interconnected with human life. Political organization ranged from small family bands to complex federations. One of the most well-known was the Iroquois Confederacy, which united 5 nations in the Northeast and had a sophisticated council system. Some scholars believe their governance ideas influenced the development of American democratic principles centuries later. Indigenous peoples also had extensive trade networks that spanned the continent. Goods like obsidian, shells, and copper were exchanged across thousands of miles. European arrival in the late 1400s and early 1500s resulted in the beginning of a catastrophic change. Diseases such as smallpox and measles, to which indigenous people had no immunity, spread rapidly and caused massive population losses. These diseases often arrived even before direct contact with colonists. Despite these tragedies, indigenous nations have endured. Their stories, knowledge, and cultural contributions remain essential to the full history of the United States. Today, Native American communities continue to protect their lands, preserve their languages, and assert their rights as sovereign nations within a modern political framework. Colonial America began in 1607, when English settlers established Jamestown in present-day Virginia. It was the first permanent English colony in North America. Backed by the Virginia Company, the settlers arrived hoping to find gold and new opportunities. Instead, they faced hunger, disease, and tense relations with the Powhatan Confederacy, the native people who lived nearby. In 1622, a coordinated attack by the Powhatan killed hundreds of settlers, which led to years of conflict and eventually pushed native populations away from their lands. Other European powers were also claiming parts of the continent. Pilgrims from England arrived in 1620 aboard the Mayflower and founded Plymouth Colony in what is now Massachusetts. Soon after, Puritans established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Dutch controlled New Netherland, including present-day New York, and the Swedes settled parts of Delaware. Over time, Britain gained dominance, and by the early 1700s, 13 British colonies had formed along the Atlantic coast. Each region developed differently. New England colonies focused on religion and education, forming tight-knit towns guided by Puritan beliefs. The middle colonies, including Pennsylvania and New York, were more diverse in terms of religion, language, and culture. The southern colonies relied heavily on agriculture. They grew crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo, using enslaved African labor. By the mid-1700s, slavery had become deeply rooted in the South's economy and society. Native American relations were complex and often violent. In New England, the Pequot War and King Philip's War led to the deaths of thousands and the destruction of many native communities. In other regions, trade and temporary alliances gave way to broken treaties and wars, especially as settlers expanded westward. Colonial governments were based on British law, but allowed some local control. Elected assemblies were formed, where white landowning men voted on laws and taxes. Although Britain remained in charge, colonists began to expect certain rights and freedoms, including the right to self-govern and make decisions about their local affairs. The economy of the colonies grew rapidly. Farming, shipping, fishing, and small-scale manufacturing created strong local economies. Cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York became centers of trade and communication. Education was valued in many areas. Religious life was also powerful. During the 1730s and 1740s, the Great Awakening swept through the colonies, bringing emotional preaching and a rise in new Protestant churches. This movement encouraged ideas of individual faith and challenged traditional authority. The French and Indian War, which lasted from 1754 to 1763, changed the relationship between the colonies and Britain. The war gave Britain control over large new territories, but it also left them with massive debts. To pay for the war, Britain began passing taxes on the colonies, like the Stamp Act and Sugar Act. These taxes upset many colonists, who argued that they should not be taxed without having representation in Parliament. Tension continued to rise, setting the stage for a revolution that would forever change American history. The Revolutionary Era began with the outbreak of armed conflict between Britain and its 13 American colonies. On April 19, 1775, British troops clashed with colonial militias at the Battle of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. These skirmishes resulted in the beginning of the American War of Independence and confirmed that the colonies were willing to take up arms in defense of their rights. Shortly after, colonial leaders gathered and formed the Continental Army, naming George Washington as its commander in June 1775. The army launched an early campaign and captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York, which contained valuable artillery. This artillery later helped Washington force the British to abandon their occupation of Boston in 1776. Protests grew stronger with incidents like the Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers killed 5 civilians, and the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where colonists dumped an entire shipment of British tea into the harbor in defiance of tax policies. Britain responded with harsh laws, and tensions reached a boiling point. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, written largely by Thomas Jefferson. The document stated that all individuals have natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments must have the consent of the people. This marked a formal break from British rule. The war raged for several more years, with key battles in New York, New Jersey, and the southern colonies. A major turning point came in 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown, where American and French forces surrounded and defeated the British army, led by General Cornwallis. This decisive victory pushed Britain to negotiate peace. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the war and recognizing the United States as an independent nation. However, winning independence was only part of the challenge. The new nation needed a system of government. The Articles of Confederation, adopted in 1777, served as the first national framework. However, it gave too much power to individual states and created a weak central government. This made it difficult to regulate trade, raise taxes, or settle disputes between states. To fix these issues, delegates met in Philadelphia in 1787 and drafted the United States Constitution. This document created a stronger federal government with 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. It also introduced checks and balances to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, and George Washington became the first president in 1789. With that, the Revolutionary Era concluded, and the United States began building its identity as a constitutional republic. The period of American expansionism from 1789 to 1848 was defined by rapid territorial growth, economic development, and a belief that the United States was destined to expand across the North American continent. This idea became known as manifest destiny, a term used to describe the belief that Americans were meant to spread their institutions and culture across the continent. Following the ratification of the Constitution and the formation of the federal government in 1789, leaders began to focus on both internal stability and outward growth. One of the most important milestones came in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. The United States, under President Thomas Jefferson, bought a vast territory from France, doubling the nation's size and providing land for future settlers. This acquisition stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. To explore this new land, Jefferson commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition. From 1804 to 1806, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led a team that mapped the territory, established relations with Native American tribes, and identified routes to the Pacific. Their journey provided valuable information and encouraged westward migration. As settlers moved west, conflicts with Native American populations increased. Indigenous tribes were pushed off their lands through treaties, military campaigns, and forced removals. One of the most infamous policies was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which led to the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Cherokee and other tribes were forced to relocate from their ancestral lands to designated areas west of the Mississippi River, resulting in widespread suffering and death. During this period, the U.S. also fought wars that led to further territorial gains. The War of 1812, fought between the United States and Britain, solidified American independence and control over the Northwest Territory. Although no major land changed hands, the war boosted national pride and weakened Native American resistance in the Great Lakes region. Later, the annexation of Texas in 1845 and tensions over border disputes with Mexico led to the Mexican-American War in 1846. After 2 years of fighting, the war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. The treaty granted the United States control over present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. This acquisition is often referred to as the Mexican Cession. At the same time, internal transportation and economic development helped tie the growing country together. The construction of canals and the expansion of railroads made it easier to move goods and people. New inventions like the cotton gin also transformed agriculture and industry. However, expansion raised tensions over the issue of slavery. As new territories were added, fierce debates broke out whether slavery should be allowed. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, and later the Compromise of 1850, attempted to maintain balance between free and slave states. These efforts only delayed the conflict. By 1848, the United States had become a coast-to-coast nation. While this period was a time of opportunity for many, it also brought displacement, war, and deep divisions that would later erupt in the Civil War. The Civil War era in the United States was a time of rising tension, deep national division, and violent conflict that would decide the future of the country. The central issue was slavery, whether it should continue to exist and expand into new territories, gained through westward expansion. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to calm tensions by admitting California as a free state, allowing some territories to decide for themselves through popular sovereignty, and strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act, which required the return of escaped slaves even from free states. This compromise only provided a temporary solution. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers in these territories to vote on the issue of slavery. This led to a violent period known as Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups clashed in deadly confrontations. Meanwhile, the issue continued to divide political parties. The Republican Party was formed in the 1850s with a strong anti-slavery platform. One of the most important legal events during this time was the 1857 Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott v. Stanford. The court ruled that African Americans were not citizens, and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in federal territories. This decision outraged many in the North, and further deepened the divide between free and slave states. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, although he promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. Southern states saw his election as a threat. Within months, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. They believed they had the right to leave the Union to protect their ways of life, which depended heavily on slavery. The Civil War officially began in April 1861, when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The conflict lasted for 4 years and became the deadliest war in American history. Over 600,000 soldiers died, and entire regions were devastated. As the war progressed, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. This executive order declared all slaves in Confederate territory to be free. While it did not independently end slavery, it changed the purpose of the war and paved the way for the eventual abolition of slavery. Major battles such as Gettysburg, Antietam, and Vicksburg turned the tide in favor of the Union. In 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, marking the effective end of the war. Shortly after the war ended, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, abolishing slavery in the United States. Reconstruction was the period following the American Civil War, when the United States faced the enormous task of reintegrating the southern states into the Union and defining the status of the newly freed black population. This era began in 1865, immediately after the war, and continued through 1900. It brought major political, legal, and social changes that would shape the country's future. 3 constitutional amendments that were passed during this period were foundational. Other than the 13th Amendment, the 14th granted citizenship to everyone born in the United States and promised equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote, prohibiting any form of racial discrimination in voting laws. The federal government created the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865 to assist formerly enslaved people. This agency helped provide food, shelter, education, and legal support. It also played a role in building schools and negotiating labor contracts for freed men. Its efforts were often limited by underfunding and violent resistance in the South. Many southern states passed laws known as black codes. These laws were designed to limit the rights of black people and keep them economically dependent on white landowners. In response, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the South into military districts. These acts required Southern states to rewrite their constitutions, ratify the 14th Amendment, and allow black men to vote. During this period, black Americans made significant political gains. Hundreds were elected to public office, from local government to Congress. Hiram Revels became the first black senator, and several others served in the House of Representatives. This political progress was supported by federal enforcement laws that protected voting rights in civil liberties. However, the rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan created a wave of violence and terror. The federal government passed the Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871 to crack down on these groups. These laws allowed federal troops to intervene where states refused to protect citizens' rights. The end of Reconstruction came in 1877 after the contested presidential election of 1876. In a political compromise, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was awarded the presidency in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South. Without military enforcement, Southern states quickly reversed many gains made during Reconstruction. Following this withdrawal, Southern lawmakers established Jim Crow laws. These laws enforced racial segregation and imposed voting restrictions like literacy tests and poll taxes, which targeted black citizens. Although the constitutional amendments remained, they were rarely enforced in the South for decades. Despite its early successes, Reconstruction ended without securing long-term equality. However, the legal changes made during this time laid the groundwork for future civil rights movements. The Progressive Era was a period of widespread social, political, and economic reform in the United States, lasting roughly from 1900 to 1919. It emerged in response to the challenges brought by rapid industrialization, urban growth, political corruption, and the growing gap between the wealthy and the poor. Reformers, known as progressives, aimed to improve American society by addressing injustices. At the local and state levels, citizens demanded more direct participation in government. This led to the introduction of initiatives, referendums, and recalls, which allowed voters to propose laws, approve or reject legislation, and remove officials from office. Labor reform was also crucial during this time. Dangerous working conditions, child labor, and long hours were widespread. Progressives pushed for new labor laws that set maximum working hours, established minimum wages, and protected the rights of workers to organize. Women played a central role in the progressive movement. Many were involved in campaigns for social welfare, education reform, and public health. The fight for women's suffrage reached a turning point during this era. After decades of activism, the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, was passed by Congress in 1919 and ratified in 1920. The Progressive Era also saw growing concerns about racial inequality, though many reforms did not extend to Black Americans or other minorities. By the end of World War I in 1918, the progressive movement had made a lasting impact on American society. Although not all reforms were successful, the era set a foundation for future changes in labor rights, business regulation, democratic participation, and social justice. The period from 1919 to 1945 was one of transformation, hardship, and global involvement for the United States. During these years, the nation faced significant economic, political, and social challenges that ultimately reshaped its role on the world stage. After World War I, the United States adopted a largely isolationist foreign policy. Although President Woodrow Wilson championed the League of Nations, the Senate rejected joining it, reflecting the nation's desire to avoid future entanglements. Domestically, the early 1920s were marked by unrest. The Red Scare sparked nationwide crackdowns on suspected radicals, and restrictive immigration laws were passed, aiming to limit the influence of foreign cultures and ideas. Racial tensions also escalated, and violent clashes occurred in several cities. Despite these tensions, the 1920s brought economic growth and cultural change. This decade, often called the Roaring Twenties, was fueled by advances in technology, mass production, and consumerism. The widespread use of automobiles, radios, and household appliances changed how Americans lived. Entertainment flourished through jazz music, cinema, and new literature. Yet, this prosperity was uneven. Many farmers and factory workers did not share in the economic boom, and speculation in the stock market created an unstable financial environment. In 1929, the stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression. Over the next few years, millions lost their jobs, banks failed, and businesses shut down. The crisis deeply affected nearly every American family. While the country struggled through the Depression, events abroad grew more troubling. Totalitarian regimes rose in Germany, Italy, and Japan, eventually leading to the outbreak of World War II in 1939. The United States remained neutral at first, though it supported the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease, which provided military aid without direct involvement. Everything changed on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan, and soon after, on Germany and Italy. The American economy shifted into full wartime production, leading to a surge surge in employment and industrial output. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, and millions of soldiers were deployed overseas. Victory in Europe came in May 1945, followed by Japan's surrender in August after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the end of the war, the United States had emerged as a global superpower, both economically and militarily. The war had lifted the nation out of depression, but it also left lasting scars and introduced new responsibilities on the world stage. The Cold War was a prolonged period of political and military tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that began shortly after World War II. Although the two powers never engaged in direct combat, they competed for global influence through alliances, proxy wars, and a race for technological and nuclear superiority. After the Allied victory in 1945, the world quickly became divided between capitalist and communist ideologies. The United States emerged as a leader of the Western Bloc, while the Soviet Union dominated the Eastern Bloc. This division was made clear as Eastern European countries fell under Soviet influence, leading to growing fears in the West. In 1947, President Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging support to countries resisting communism. This policy of containment guided American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. The same year, the Marshall Plan was introduced, providing economic aid to help rebuild war-torn Europe and prevent the spread of communism. Tensions increased with events like the Berlin Blockade in 1948 and the formation of rival military alliances. In 1949, the United States and its allies established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Soviet Union responded with the Warsaw Pact in 1955. That same year, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, initiating a dangerous arms race. By the 1950s, both nations were stockpiling nuclear weapons capable of mass destruction. During this time, the fear of communism spread within the United States. The Red Scare led to investigations and blacklists targeting suspected communists, especially in government and entertainment. The Cold War also played out through indirect military conflicts known as proxy wars. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 was the first major conflict, with the United States supporting South Korea against the Communist North, backed by China and the Soviet Union. Later, the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s became another major front, where the United States faced strong opposition and public criticism at home. Perhaps the most dangerous moment came in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the United States discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, it led to a tense standoff that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The crisis was resolved diplomatically, and afterward both sides began pursuing arms control agreements, such as the Limited Test Ban Treaty. The 1970s saw a period of eased tensions, but the invasion of Afghanistan by Soviet forces in 1979 led to renewed hostility. In the 1980s, under President Ronald Reagan, the United States adopted a more aggressive stance, increasing defense spending and pressuring the Soviet economy. The Cold War began to wind down when Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms aimed at openness and restructuring. These changes weakened Soviet control, and by 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. It ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The modern period of American history began in 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. This era has been defined by rapid technological advancements, economic transformations, major political events, and shifting global influence. President George H.W. Bush oversaw the transition from Cold War geopolitics to a new international order. His administration led a coalition in the Gulf War of 1990 to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, showing continued American military leadership after the Cold War. At home, the early 1990s were defined by a mild recession and increased concern about domestic issues like crime and healthcare. Bill Clinton's presidency in the 1990s focused on economic growth, welfare reform, and a balanced federal budget. The US economy expanded rapidly due to the growth of the technology sector and the rise of the internet. The Clinton era also witnessed the signing of NAFTA, a major free trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. However, political scandals led to Clinton's impeachment by the House of Representatives in 1998. He was later acquitted by the Senate. The September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon resulted in a turning point. In response, President George W. Bush launched the War on Terror, which included wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. These conflicts shaped American foreign policy for nearly 2 decades and sparked national debates about civil liberties, torture, and military spending. Domestically, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the passage of the Patriot Act significantly expanded government surveillance powers. The 2008 financial crisis caused widespread unemployment and a global recession. In 2009, Barack Obama became the first African American president and introduced a major economic stimulus package in the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. His administration focused on healthcare reform, climate change, and financial regulation. The election of Donald Trump in 2016 reflected deep political and cultural divisions. His presidency included major tax cuts, deregulation, a more confrontational approach to immigration, and trade conflicts with China. Trump was impeached twice, first over dealings with Ukraine, and later for inciting the January 6 Capitol riot, though he was acquitted both times. The COVID-19 pandemic beginning in 2020 caused over 1 million deaths in the United States and exposed weaknesses in healthcare infrastructure, supply chains, and political unity. The 2020 presidential election led to the inauguration of Joe Biden, whose administration focused on pandemic recovery, infrastructure investment, climate policy, and restoring international alliances. Throughout the modern era, technology has reshaped daily life. The rise of smartphones, social media, and artificial intelligence has transformed how Americans work, communicate, and consume information. At the same time, movements for racial justice, gender equality, and environmental protection have gained momentum, reflecting ongoing efforts to expand rights and address inequality. Modern America continues to evolve through innovation, civic debate, and its global role in a rapidly changing world. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like. Comment down below your thoughts on any period of the United States I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see more videos like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.